Hey everybody. So since I went over the 8th house specifically last time, I wanted to go over the 12th house as well, make a separate video about the 12th house. It's another house that tends to get misunderstood. Well, or maybe it's not that it gets misunderstood. It tends to be kind of like the 8th. It tends to get thought of more negatively than I think it actually should. That doesn't mean there aren't negative things to it, or rather challenging things. Let's say it like that, challenging things to it. But I feel like too often those challenging things are what are harped on. And yeah, so I kind of wanted to go over the 12th house. Here is the card for it, right? So you can see things like dream, escape, hidden enemies, martyrdom, all that kind of stuff falls under the domain of the 12th house. We also have, okay, a big thing that I want to talk about in relation to the 12th house is karma. Now, I'm not really sure where it comes from. But there seems to be this idea floating around that the 12th house is always karmic, and you always find past life karma there. I guess that's a matter of opinion. I have not found that to always be the case in practice. Sometimes, yes, and it is certainly a place that I might look first, along with like the South Node and Pluto and things like that. I would look at the 12th house just as I would look at Saturn, for sure. But the 12th house, I don't buy that it's always karmic. I think it's possible, but I don't buy that it's always there. Somehow that feels too easy to me. I don't know. It feels too easy. Life isn't easy. So, well, I would certainly say to look there. I don't think that it's universal. Oh, you have such and such in the 12th house. It's karmic. That's a karmic thing. Not always. I don't think that you should be so rigid in that. Certainly can be, but not always. Another thing I wanted to talk about with the 12th house that I don't think always gets mentioned is the idea of the time in utero before you're born. I kind of touched on this in the last video with the 8th, 12th, and 4th connection with the water, the houses that have affinity with the water signs. There are some that feel like the 12th house can show, especially the 12th house, especially the closer that you approach the ascendant, can show the period of time after conception, but before you're actually born. Such as things that perhaps your mother felt, or your father felt, or other family members felt about your impending arrival. Things of that nature can be seen by the 12th house. Again, this is not, I wouldn't say it's a universal, always the case, but I have found it to be pretty on a lot of the time. And then of course and then another way to think about this, or to add another dimension to it, is the actual process of birth. Not right after being born, but the actual birth process. People that have planets conjunct the ascendant from the 12th house, that can tend to show something about the actual laboring process before you made your arrival into the world as your own, detached from your mother as your own person living on your own. So that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of the 12th house, those sorts of things. It's a very psychic house. It is a very spiritual house. So any planets that happen to fall in the 12th do tend to kind of have a spiritual charge to them, perhaps even a psychic charge to them. Which, depending on, what the rest of the chart looks like, the person may or may not handle that very well. I know, okay, I'm a 12th house Sagittarius sun, and I spent a good portion of my teenage years, in my early 20s, running away from not astrology, but the things that I would pick up from other people and from just the world around me. I didn't quite know how to deal with that. So I kind of became my own worst enemy in that way. So depending on, but there are other people that might have leaned into that much earlier than I did, come to terms with it much earlier than I did. If you did, that's awesome. You probably saved yourself a lot of grief. But yeah, depending on what the rest of the chart looks like, and any planets in the 12th, there usually is a spiritual charge, at the very least, a spiritual charge to those planets, or to that planet. And then, depending on the rest of the chart, will depend on how the person handles that. So the sign that rules the 12th in your chart tends to live in the unconscious more than it's consciously expressed. So depending on what that sign is, will kind of give you an idea of what your unconscious is like. For instance, Gemini, and this is just a for instance, because again, your entire chart matters here, but Gemini ruling the 12th house, person might be unconsciously anxious about things that they don't really know why they're anxious about things. There's just kind of an undercurrent of anxiety. They might even have some anxiety around things like communication and basic thinking, an expression of such. Hidden enemies is another one for this house. They very much exist. I think the hidden, and this is just my personal opinion, I think the hidden enemies thing tends to come out more to play when you actually see planets in that house. Because you'll always have a sign ruling that house cusp, but you might not always have planets there. I think the hidden enemies thing comes out more when you actually have planets in that house. But again, that's of course not universal. You might be thinking, I got Cancer in my 12th house, I need planets there, and I got hidden enemies, it feels like out the ass. And that very well could be, but I have noticed that seems to be more of a thing when there are actual planets there. Let me see, on this card we also have, and conning yourself. Jesus Christ, this is the house to do that in. Where, the things that you kind of lie to yourself about, delude yourself about, that kind of shit happens here. Again, I think it probably happens more when you have planets there. So for people that have planets there, especially, make sure you're not doing that. Or really just in general, regardless, make sure you're not doing that. Is there anything else I wanted to cover here? Grief and loss. I think that's another reason why this gets treated more negatively than it actually should. grief and loss does tend to swim in 12th house waters. Especially the sorts of grief and loss that perhaps we're not even totally aware of why we feel that in the first place. Or we have an idea of why, but perhaps we aren't fully sure where it stems from. That's 12th house shit. That's total 12th house shit. Yeah, but I do want to say, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover that was actually on the card. But I do want to say it is a magical place too. It gets talked about in such a challenging way. It really is such a magical place when you learn how to work with the energy well. When you learn how to work with the planets that fall there, should any fall there. When you learn how to work with the sign that rules the 12th house cusp, when you learn how to work with the ruler of that sign of the 12th house cusp. It is a very magical place where good things do happen and dreams do come true and all of those things. So it's definitely not a unilaterally negative place. But yeah. So I guess I'll go and you'll see me later. I'll see y'all later too.